It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the semi-final round of the 2011 Canadian Central Championships. Seated on my left, representing the government, are some team from Hart House.
Seated George Trotter after last night.
Shut up. Seated on my right. Seated on my right, representing the opposition, are some team from Queens.
Yeah.
Pause for applause.
Yeah.
Without any further ado, oh yeah, some total ballers are judging you today.
And sorry.
Myself not least among them. And now, without any further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to rise and speak to the motion that stands in his name. Hear, hear. Oh, PMRE or no?
Yes.
Yes. Ooh. Split off or no?
No.
Ah.
We are doing acclamation. They are not, therefore they're clearly not.
Alright, let's go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Death penalty cases typically bore me because there's all kinds of practical considerations that make the application of the death penalty completely unjustifiable. We're going to remove all of those considerations from the debate. All we're going to argue today is that the death penalty is a morally unjustifiable form of punishment. The state shouldn't be in the business of taking people's lives. No practical considerations, just is it justifiable to ever have the death penalty, even if you can apply it. I think that's true. Okay, so I have three arguments I want to present. First of all, I want to talk about the harms principle that exists with comparison to rights and expand on the purpose of the justice system that we see on site government. Secondly, I'm talking about why the death penalty represents cruel and unusual punishment that amounts to psychological torture, and we shouldn't use it for that reason. Lastly, I'm going to talk about obligations of society and a duty to try, at least, to rehabilitate it. So, first of all, the purpose of the justice system and the harms principle. So I think, Mr. Speaker, the conception of the justice system that we would have on our side of the House, one of the things it ought to do is try in dealing with crimes to restrict the rights that individuals used to commit those crimes. A couple of examples will make this much more clear now. So, if an individual uses their freedom of movement, their right to be free in society, to steal things, that harms other people, and we ought to restrict their right of movement, and we put them in jail for that. If individuals use their right to free speech to incite hatred and violence, we ought to take away their right to free speech because they're using that right to harm other people. Mr. Speaker, it's our contention today outside government that merely existing even apart from society in jail, I think, can't have any harmful effects on individuals. You can use your other rights, movement and speech, to harm other individuals, but I don't think you can reasonably use your right to life to inflict harm on others. I think it's going to be incumbent on opposition to show why these people living in society, no thank you, imposes some kind of harm on other people, why we're justified in restricting rights for that reason. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, under this, I think the restriction or removal of rights that we do in the criminal justice system should be commensurate with the actions, not merely the person has done, but with the actions that we're trying to prevent. We put people in jail, for instance, because we don't want them, I'll take you one moment, to go around killing. But, Mr. Speaker, at the point where someone is already in jail, I don't think we really have to worry about them going around and killing people furthermore, so I don't think there's any kind of preemptive rights restriction because we think these people are going to go and commit more crimes. That's not possible because we can sentence them to life in jail and never let them out.
Okay, so why can't their presence in jail be harmful in and of itself, and how come they still can't disturb the victims of that crime?
So like you found the opt, you get a speech to make that. I would encourage you to do so. Lastly, I think there are a series of things that the justice system tries to accomplish. Protect society, deter crime, rehabilitate offenders, and recompense victims. The death penalty, Mr. Speaker, it's our contention on this side of the House, accomplishes none of these. It doesn't protect society because you can accomplish that just as easily by keeping them in jail. It doesn't rehabilitate offenders, obviously. It doesn't deter individuals. It's empirically shown in many jurisdictions that have the death penalty that has no deterrent effect. And lastly, it doesn't provide recompense to victims or to society as a whole. Note, Mr. Speaker, that even if you execute the individual, even if the family wants you to, as I'm sure we're going to hear from side opposition, even if they want to, that doesn't recompense them, doesn't bring their relative and loved one back. It only soothes societal desire for catharsis that would come from killing a bad person. Any kind of society that thrives on that kind of catharsis, that bases a justice system on that kind of catharsis, is our contention, Mr. Speaker, is an entirely unjust one. So, secondly, why is this cruel and unusual punishment? Mr. Speaker, to be crude, death is fucking scary, right? Like, no, we don't know much about what's going to happen after we die. The fear of the unknown is hugely problematic for a lot of people. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't wander around society constantly fearing death. Why? Because individuals can take, in our view, at least 3 steps that minimize their fear of death. First of all, your chances of dying are like absurdly small in ordinary society, so it's not a risk that you feel imposing on you. Secondly, individuals can take actions to minimize the possibility of death by taking less risks. And finally, the most important one, Mr. Speaker, I believe, is that individuals don't know when they're going to die, so living your life racked by fear is impossible, and indeed people don't do it. None of those, Mr. Speaker, apply to individuals on death row. Their chances of dying are 100%, they can't take actions to minimize that, and they have an end date on their life that they know they're going to be executed on. I think all of those, Mr. Speaker, combine to provide a horrible effect on this person's mind. It amounts, Mr. Speaker, in our opinion, outside government, to psychological torture. It is cruel and unusual, and we ought not support it. So lastly, the obligations of society. And I want to be clear before this gets strawman. I'm not saying society makes people commit crimes. But, Mr. Speaker, there are often societal factors that influence people towards criminality. So, Mr. Speaker, when they commit crimes, what ought society's obligations be? Our obligations ought be to, I think, attempt to rehabilitate, attempt to provide individuals with means to actualize. Even if we have to take away lots of their rights to ensure they don't harm society, we still ought to provide them some kind of. I would point out, Mr. Speaker, that people can reform after committing terribly heinous crimes and can reform on death row. I think our society has an obligation to try to facilitate that, to make the world a better place, and indeed to ensure that we are fulfilling our obligations to people that society has, that have violated our rules. Mr. Speaker, I don't think there's any action you can take that justifies the state taking away your life. We're going to have to hear from side opposition why the right to live, like living in a prison cell, is something that harms other individuals, because if merely existing doesn't harm other individuals, there's clear, I think, harms that are demonstrated to killing them. Mr. Speaker, we're very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and I now call upon the member opposite to deliver his 7-minute speech in response. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and following members of the panel. I'm going to do a couple things for you today. I'm going to bring up 2 constructive points about how punishment is sometimes designed to compensate the victim, and how the presence of these people in jail can be harmful. And I think it's interesting to note that when I brought up some of these principles on POI, they weren't just answered, they were just directed for me to talk about it more now, which I will. So we're going to get into some refutation. So let's talk first about how the punishment is designed to compensate the victim. So I think in some scenarios of like heinous murder, which is generally what lands you on death row in the first place, like the family absolutely seeks restitution for these kind of crimes. And there's no way that you can like meaningfully convince a family that just having this person isolated from society for the rest of their lives is equatable to the kinds of harms that they've gone through. I think that's one of the pillars of justice in this scenario, Mr. Speaker, that sometimes a crime can be so bad that we can justify murder to recompensate for that crime. Particularly, Mr. Speaker, if you're something like a mass murder. I think we're dealing with this on like an isolated scale with like maybe one murder in jail. Picture, Mr. Speaker, that you're Saddam Hussein. You've not only like harmed just individual citizens, you've created larger harms to society. And we think in those cases, sometimes it can even be symbolic to have your removal from this world as like a major compensation to the victim in this scenario. So we don't think we can rule out the idea that like rehabilitation 100% of the time is good, but I'll get into that later. So we think also like it provides this kind of restitution. Also along the moral lines in which we can do this. When you commit a crime and you go to jail, technically you're not a citizen anymore, right? We think in that regards you can't vote, you don't really have the same rights, you've been removed from the general principles of society, as it were, and we think that in restitution for your crimes, we as a society can determine what the punishment is, and we think in this case that can be extremely valuable. We also think, on a note on rehabilitating the victims, there's no real ends to justify the means in this scenario. We think we can get an absolute phenomenon where the rehabilitation would be fake. I mean, if you are a mass murderer, and we spend 20 to 30 years trying to drive these tendencies from you, It's very plausible that you might be doing this just to get out of jail. And even if you do, even if you've rehabilitated and you've gotten out of jail after all that time, tell me meaningfully what you're going to contribute to society. What we need to weigh in this particular instance is the direct restitution that we provide the victims of the scenario, the surviving family members of a murder or a mass murder or a genocide, versus like this one individual right to this guy eventually having the possibility to get out of prison. But we'll talk about that a little later in my second point. You disagree?
What rights do victims have to enact revenge on those who apparently victimized them?
Okay, so I think the victims are entitled in the justice system to like a base level of restitution. I mean, like, I think when we see kind of like financial thefts, for example, we see like a compensation that's delivered to the victim in most of the scenarios that we can do that. Like, we equate what the criminal has done with the crime to the best possible way of providing restitution to the victim. If somebody has stolen from you and we meaningfully say we're going to isolate that person, not have them in society anymore, we're now providing you safety as the victim in this scenario, we think that's good. We think if you've been wronged in a way that equals murder to that extent, we think also having that person permanently removed from this world, having that symbolic eye for an eye measure, we think is very, very much relevant in this case. Let's talk about my second constructive point, which is that the very presence of these people remaining in jail for like essentially what could be an indefinite period of time is harmful. I found the op here. So we think, one, we can definitely have, like, if you, Mr. Speaker, are not such a baller, you are a mass murderer, we think you can absolutely enact harm to the other prisoners despite your isolation on death row. We think you can do this on several levels. You can do it psychologically, and you potentially have the opportunity, if that isolation isn't perfect, our prison system isn't perfect, for you to harm these prisoners physically. We also think that in your presence there, you can meaningfully harm the rehabilitation process of others. We think you can influence people on a mental level towards not seeking that kind of rehabilitation, not doing that. We think that's a big problem as well. I think also, it is a very meaningful point to say that a murderer's very existence in prison, where my state tax dollars are going to feed and maintain, can absolutely be like a harmful psychological burden for the victims of a murder to eat in this scenario. Like, if my family was murdered and I'm the survivor, and I know that implicitly my taxes go towards the maintenance of the man who did that, I particularly think it's harmful in this scenario for me to have to eat that every single day. I think the best restitution that you can give me is to remove him from this world, to see the same things that happened to my family.
How does that even maintain the facade of being right when in actuality, a person being on death row and going through the appeals process costs far more than it would ever cost for them to be in the prison system?
So we didn't want to really argue practicality in this scenario since they said we weren't going to do that. But I think, like, at the end of the day, even if they get the appeals, that's like taking advantage of an arbitrary, or not arbitrary, the arbiters of the justice system, and if the justice system okays my restitution as a victim, I have the interest in seeing them dead, that's fine. I'm okay with giving them the right to appeal and having that money, as long as I still get that restitution at the end of the day that he's removed from this world because he removed a loved one of mine. I think that's acceptable to you here. We also think, in getting into some direct refutation, that Penner brought up some interesting things in talking about the harm principle. He said that essentially we can't use the right of the state to just enact any punishment we want on these people. And then we have kind of state obligations. And he said that, like, rehab is good in this scenario. But I provided you an example, Mr. Speaker, where rehabilitation fails. We think, like, there's a lot of different mental checks on whether that process will be effective. I'm willing to say that Paul Bernardo is probably not going to, like, meaningfully regret his crimes down the future. And we think that there is this idea that people who do seek that rehabilitation actually alter their personalities in a way that isn't fair to them. Maybe to them, the way they self-actualize is murdering is okay. That doesn't gel with the mesh I try to create in my society, and I'm all right removing them from that. That's something that we just can't reconcile with every murderer in the justice system in this particular scenario. We also heard this striking analysis about how the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. Because you put this person on death row, and they just have to sit there and think about the eventuality that they're going to die. I think there's an analogy to be drawn here, Mr. Speaker, that in many of these cases, they could have put the victims or the surviving victims of these scenarios through similar mental trauma. I would say if you've murdered someone, they experience some distress as well, and I'm perfectly okay putting that same kind of distress and angst on you while you sit on death row. I'm particularly okay doing that in a way that provides restitution to the victim. So I think that's what's really effective here, and for all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose this motion.
now call upon the Minister of the Crown to deliver his 7-minute speech. Here, here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is my first semifinals round. Let's hope Deirdre doesn't psych me out again. All right, so I'm going to get started with going over some rebuttal of what happened on the other side, and then I'm going to get back into rebuilding a lot of Steve's case. So the first, they basically planted their flag on 2 issues in this case, and that's what they want to talk about. It was the idea that punishment is designed to compensate the victim, which is really flawed, and I'll get into why. And the second idea that the presence of these people is somehow harmful, which is even more of a problem. So basically, the first thing that they came up here and said was the idea that the family deserves restitution. You're not going to hear side government argue that that isn't the case, Madam Speaker and Mr. Speakers. But what we would say to you is that they completely misinterpret the actual word restitution and how that applies. Restitution would be getting their loved one back, not enacting revenge on that individual. It's completely ridiculous to suggest that somehow enacting revenge on that individual will actually do anything to the family that is enacted upon. And even if it would give them some sort of joy, we don't think that that's a joy that the justice system should be pursuing at all. We explain that quite thoroughly. So no, not at this time. So another thing that I'd like to talk about is they say, well, no, they're no longer a citizen and they no longer have rights. So even if you buy this analysis that basically they're in prison and we shouldn't give them any sort of treatment, this is really flawed because the idea is that the justice system isn't meant to basically, is only meant to take away rights insofar as they harm other people, Mr. Speaker. It's not to say, you stole something so you don't have any rights anymore, you can't vote, you can't do this, you can't do that. That's not the purpose of the justice system. The justice system is largely concerned with serving justice, the appearance of justice, and just outcomes, as well as actually rehabilitating prisoners. And under their model, that just doesn't happen. So another thing that I'd like to talk about is they talked about this idea that it's okay to use retributive justice, because they enacted psychological harms on someone else, so it is okay that they are afraid to die because basically they had that same feeling for someone else. Madam Speaker, note that if I was to say to Ryan, if Ryan was to commit hate speech, he would not be submitted to me and Penner, locked in a room, saying, you suck, and giving hate and slander for 3 hours at a time. That is not how the justice system works, and I'd like to hear some analysis on how that actually applies, because he basically just said we should have retributive justice, but never explained why. So the next idea that he brought up was, I didn't start my timer, was this idea of the presence of these people is basically just harmful. So we explained to you quite thoroughly why the presence is only harmful to the individuals on a superficial level, Mr. Speaker. So the harm that they cause to these individuals is psychological, but largely isn't going to be reversed if they are killed. The best that can happen is they're like, well, they're not walking the streets, but my loved one was still killed by them. The memory will still haunt the person that this was actually committed to. There is no guarantee on their side of the house that this is not still going to happen. And even if it was going to happen, the justice system shouldn't be concerned with revenge or retributive justice insofar as that's concerned. We gave you an example of why. Another thing is that, and I really, honestly, truly did not understand this argument, was that you can influence others to not to rehabilitate. He didn't really give you any analysis as to why others wouldn't rehabilitate if you were in jail with a criminal, because, you're just in jail with criminals, that's what happens. In order for you to say something like that and for it to actually matter, you need to tell me how other criminals are going to think differently when that's going to happen. I don't know how to debate, I don't know how to refute a point that wasn't explained. So the next thing that we were going to talk about is that, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, is they didn't want to debate practicalities about this idea of the taxes. I'm not going to touch on it anyway. So I'm going to get back into some of the harms and things that Steve talked about, and basically reform the 3 points that were brought up. So the first idea is this idea of the harms principle. And I really think that if side opposition wants to win this case, they need to conflict with it a lot more. The idea that we present to you on this side of the house is that the harms principle engages with criminals on a level where we take away their rights only insofar as they can affect someone else, right? So if you steal, we restrict your rights of movement. If you kill someone, we basically lock you up. I'll take you in a second. And if you commit hate speech, we basically deprive you of the right to freedom of speech. This is a pretty clear analysis, and I think that it's important for them to understand. Yes?
Okay, so won't knowing that that murderer is in prison and you're feeding them through their tax dollars affect you mentally as the victim in that scenario? That's outside of that.
All right, so I didn't want to debate this because you're clearly wrong, and the reason I didn't want to debate this is because it is just factually true that their tax dollars cost more if they lead to the death of this person than if they were just to have them locked up. I gave you an actual reason why that's true, and I don't want to do it. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is this idea that Like, there is no actual harm that just comes from someone existing. Just by the right of being alive, even if you are in jail, the only possible harm that they've been able to come up with that might exist is that it has a psychological trauma on the victims that already exist. We've explained to you why that's problematic for the justice system to engage in this facade of justice where it basically tries to inflict the exact same harms back on all of the people that it were committed to, and how that isn't going to actually work, Mr. Speaker. So if they actually think that, that this harm doesn't exist, they need to explain it better. The other thing that we talked about is there really isn't a deterrent, right? There isn't a deterrent for, like, in terms of the death penalty for them to not go out, like, for them to not commit the crime anyway. If you are to commit murder, Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I should probably stop saying Speaker, you are not going to consider that, you know, if I murder this person, well, I might be killed versus spending my entire life in jail. If you're going to kill someone, you're going to do it because you either think you're not going to get caught or because you don't give a shit about the consequences of your action. So this entire analysis of argument about, like, the deterrent just doesn't appear, like, doesn't work in this case. So the next thing that we talked about is the idea of how this is cruel and unusual for the I'll take you in a second, for the people who are put in prison, and basically why this is basically considered psychological torture. Yeah, I'll take you.
Okay, so if people commit murder for those reasons, they don't give a shit about the consequences, how are you going to rehabilitate them? They were happy doing it in the first place.
So basically, like, what we're saying is that there's not going to be situations where you can rehabilitate them all the time, Madam Speaker and Mr. Speakers, but there is an obligation to try and rehabilitate those if it is possible. There is no way of knowing if a serial killer or a murderer in any situation has an ability to be rehabilitated unless you actually try. The death penalty completely removes the chance of this ever happening. It just can't happen. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is, like, I'm really conflicted with this idea of how like, the chances of death are small and you're going to be afraid. They basically conceded that they are going to be afraid. We don't think the justice system should apply sentences onto those who committed crimes that would basically be harmful in those ways. So I'm going to talk about the last thing, which is the obligations of society, which he brought up a POI and I started talking about briefly. So we do think that it's very important that society realize that justice isn't just a concept for justice's sake, and that retributive justice doesn't have any actual, like, good besides, like, this weird notion of compensating the victim. Justice is cold and calculating and tries to take away rights only insofar as they affect other people, and it's important to note that justice is served in those manners. It is for this and many other reasons that we think about it.
I thank the Minister of the Crown for his speech, and I now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to deliver his 10-minute speech, reminding him that he may bring up no new arguments or evidence in the last 3 minutes of his speech, except in direct refutation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm not going to call this case silly, but I just want to point out that they took PMRE. Okay, moving on. Op-whip style. I have 3 questions I want to ask. First, can the state justifiably kill these people? Second, can we rehabilitate these people? Thirdly, fucking criminal justice systems, how do they work? Okay, first question. Can the state justifiably kill these people? Basically, government got up here and tried to give us 2 main principled stances, I think, why morally we could never kill these people, right? First, they talk about why, like, in all of these other, like crime, punishment, etc., we try and apply some sort of, like, proportionality, right? And that, like, you incite hate speech, violence against others, we take away your right to expression, you try and like, attack someone, we take away your ability, etc., etc., right? But we think, like, I think we both agree that it should be proportional, but I think what they would have to prove, like, what they have to prove on their side of the house is, like, essentially that you could never justify proportionally taking away someone's life, right? And I think all Ryan and I have to do is prove on our side of the house. I think Ryan gave you a lot of good examples why. There are principled cases where we think proportionally what they've done is bad enough, or what they could do is bad enough, that we can proportionally and justifiably take away their right to life, right? And I'll get into that in a later session, right? There are other sort of main line of analysis on this concept of justification was like the harms principle, right? Like what they could potentially take away in the future, right? If you could potentially use your freedom of speech to take away other people's rights, we restrict that as well, right? We think in a lot of these cases, your very existence or your continued existence or the possibility of you being free in society in the future can can take away other people's right to life in the future sense, right? We think you can, and that's like why we think we are justified in killing you sort of at this moment in time before you can do further damage to society. Ryan gave you a lot of good construction of that, and I'll sort of talk about it later, right? So basically, they didn't say why they thought there was never going to be a crime that could proportionally justify death, right? And I think I've just established that emergence proof in any case scenario. And Ryan gave you a lot of good examples. I'm going to talk about them deeper, right? So a few examples, right? We think you can have a crime so heinous that you proportionally don't deserve your right to life to continue, right? We just posit that, like, your right to life isn't necessarily inalienable, right? Because we've used that label to a lot of other rights, like freedom of speech is an inalienable right, freedom of mobility and expression, etc., and religion, etc. But we all agree that there are some instances where it is possible to restrict even those rights we would term as inalienable, right? So we don't think sort of right to life is some sort of like golden standard that we absolutely cannot touch in any case scenario, right? So we've given you examples, right? Murderers, like, so for instance, mass murderers, serial killers, who have like performed heinous acts of torment and torture, etc., upon their victims, right? We think those kind of crimes are so proportionally heinous that we can justify taking away your inherent right to life, right? To give you an example of genocidal sort of leaders, right? For instance, we killed Saddam Hussein, right? That was capital punishment. We think there are instances where someone's actions have harmed so many people that just putting them in jail for life doesn't actually proportionally match up to the level of crime and level of harm to society they've committed. And that's why we think we are justified in those instances of killing them. We're more than justified, right? We think there's also cases where your very existence harms the prison populace, right? Where your existence and your presence in prison can either cause violence in and of itself, you causing violence, other people reacting violently against you because they don't like what you've done, for instance. You could foment unrest or violence from, like, while you're still in prison, you could have more huge harm to society. Or as Ryan said, your very continued existence could have lots of tangible harms to your victims as well, just your continued existence, and I'll expand on this later. I think those are all cases where your very existence and your very right to continued life infringes upon the rights of others in like tangible ways that we can proportionally justify our right to kill you. And finally, so their last point under like can the state justify killing these people was like it's sort of cruel and unusual punishment, right? They didn't actually, I think it's curious that they didn't actually try to justify whether death was bad in that sense. Their only sort of constructive is why knowing when you die was sort of a huge harm, right? Wait, I think we brought forth two real like constructive analyses against this, right? Like one, I think, is knowing when you die, that sort of psychological torment, in any case, as Ryan said, is sort of negligible compared to what you've done and what you continue to do by your very existence. So we think it's negligible. But Ryan also very nicely questioned why do we care? Right? In that the very concept of you being a criminal, you having committed a crime so heinous we're even considering the death penalty in the first place, you have so far removed yourself from society, I don't think we necessarily care whether you get a little bit freaked out about the fact that you're going to die, right? We don't think that's a large enough harm to say we can never morally justify killing anyone. I'm done my first theme, so if anyone has a POI. No. Okay, so second theme, can we rehabilitate these people? So Ryan said you can harm others in prison, you can harm the prison populace, and you can there's cases where you can prevent other people from rehabilitating. Right? And Steve's partner asked, right, I don't know your name, asked like, when does that ever happen? I'll give you a very prime example, right? In a lot of cases, who we apply the death penalty to are individuals who have life sentences, who while they're still in prison, kill other people or kill other guards, right? They violently attack someone while they're still in prison, and then we say, okay, that's far enough, we're killing it, right? Why is that, Mr. Steve, right? One is I think that's a very clear proof all of our attempts at rehabilitating you have failed. Right? And that we've tried to we've gone to our societal obligations to try and cure you of whatever mental derangements you have, and it's failed, and I'll take you in a minute, right? And we don't think that, and we think that your very presence poses a danger to other criminals and prevents them from rehabilitating, right? Either by your presence inciting them, or to you having killed another prisoner who can then no longer rehabilitate themselves.
So even in the context of murdering another prisoner or a prison guard, how does not just putting them in solitary confinement with a guard contingent not solve that same?
People have escaped or killed guards in solitary confinement, right? I think these are examples. These are the examples we think prove our case, right? That there are rare instances we think, legitimately rare instances, but there are instances where you can kill someone because their very continued existence still poses such a constant threat to individuals in society that we are fully justified in permanently removing you from there, right? We think it is a huge harm to others who could have been rehabilitated, that you are in the same prison environment, that you could have harmed them tangibly, right? Or that your presence sets bad examples or sets unrest and violence in that sense that actually prevent, in a lot of cases, a rehabilitation. Or the fact that you just kill your prison guards in a lot of these cases. Those people don't deserve to die. Your continued existence and life in this prison environment harms them and endangers them. That's why we think those instances we're justified in just removing you outright from the prison sentence, right? On the concept, what they brought forth essentially is we must rehabilitate these people, right? I think Ryan and I gave you a lot of good analysis why we don't think the state has an unlimited liability to rehabilitate every single individual who commits a crime, right? So why? Because we have to admit, Mr. Speaker, I think, some of the burden and some of the fault is borne by the criminal, right? Like, even though the society tries to rehabilitate someone because we failed them in some way, some point in their life society has failed them, we think some fault is borne on them, right? So we think, therefore, logically, that there is a certain point or threshold we reach in which we as society have done all we possibly can to try and rehabilitate you. And if you still can't be rehabilitated into normal society, then that leftover part is your fault. And we've reached all of the extent of our obligation to rehabilitate you, and you still fail. You still go on being a menace to other prisoners. You still try and you still have no remorse. You're still a danger. You still commit acts of violence. We think that's the point at which we say we have done all we possibly and legitimately, justifiably could do reasonably to rehabilitate you. We have failed, or it doesn't work on you. We don't think your continuing existence is valid in society, right? We don't think we have that unlimited liability. And we think that level is undue hardship, right? We think the government has gone, in a lot of these cases, or in these rare cases, we have reached that level, as Ryan said, and we just don't have the ability to rehabilitate you anymore, so we give up trying, and we take you out of society, because you're still a danger, right? Because you take on the sort of broader harm of what they could do if they're still left alive, right? That you are sort of responsible if they do kill other prisoners, if they're allowed out in society, as Ryan said, and kill other people as well, right? You take on that burden. We don't think you should. You don't have unlimited liability in terms of rehabilitation. Okay. Last question is sort of the criminal system. How do they work? So this is where like the 4 pillars comes into play that Steve talks about, right? I think it's telling that Steve only really examined them for like 30 seconds, right? But I'll talk about why all this analysis was wrong, right? So for instance, government talked a lot about restitution, right? And why we misunderstood restitution because the only way you can tangibly restore a victim is like to give them the loved one back, which is impossible under like a murder case, right? So we disagree, right? So an example I'd give to you, Mr. Speaker, is like this. One of the reasons family members grieve, for instance, is like they think it's really unfair that their loved one's life was cut short, right? All that potential, all of that life was cut short unfairly, right? And they've died. And the grief is because like we just don't think they should have died. It's really unfair. And that's why, as Ryan said, they want these criminals dead, right? Because they think it's patently unfair that someone who has taken so much potential, so much like unrealized joy out of their loved one's life, out of their own life, is unfair. And it's unfair because they get the right of continued life, right? We don't think that is proportional. We don't think that allows any sort of restitution, right? We think that's why in a lot of cases, as Ryan said, like we understand we can't fully restore you by reviving your dead loved one. We realize it gives us more of a measure of restitution by allowing, like giving the victims more peace in killing these individuals. Not only from a beneficial perspective, as Ryan said, but also talk about why there's a negative sort of negative impact of keeping these individuals alive. Then in a lot of cases, as Ryan said, keeping these mass murderers alive, or these like victims, murderers alive, actually has tangible consequences to the actual ability for these individuals to reach closure, right? And that they're constantly tormented by the fact that they know this individual alive, that they're still living, despite the fact that their loved family member is no longer living, right? That has huge negative consequences that we think in a lot of ways goes a long way towards restoration, right? We think under the concept of retribution, this again gets into sort of the central theme of this debate, right? We think there are crimes against society, that you've done so much damage to society that the only way the state can proportionally get back that retribution is to take away your life, right? And he gave you examples of like genocide or mass murderers on a really torturous scale, right? I don't think they gave us why in none of those cases you can proportionally have retribution that reaches the point of taking away the right to life, right? On the concept of deterrence, I don't think this mattered too much in today's debate, right? I don't think the concept of death penalty deterrence, so I'll just move on from that. The last pillar is like removal from society, right? And this is where a lot of Ryan's analysis really stands, right? That having these individuals in society, in some rare cases, their continued existence is not, like their continued existence in jail is not a sufficient removal from societal structures. That there comes a point where these individuals are so heinous, so bad, so rehabilitable, that they need to be removed from life, period. Not just removed from society and placed behind a bar where they can still cause a lot of violence. For all of those reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his speech, and I now call upon the Prime Minister to deliver his 4-minute rebuttal speech to close off the round.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First issue in the round raised by opposition, Wudi harps on it a lot. Individuals in jail can still commit crimes in jail. This argument probably sounded fairly convincing, but, Mr. Speaker, I think there's a huge problem. If the law assumes that jail and the correctional system, even with solitary confinement, can't control people, I think that's a good argument for building a better correctional system, I don't think it undermines any of the moral arguments that we've made about why it's wrong to kill individuals. That's a very good argument for designing better correctional systems. I don't think it's an argument as to why the state has a right to kill. Second issue, proportionality. So this is also something that they harped on a lot. They think that justice ought to be proportional. Note, Mr. Speaker, that you're never going to get proportional justice for someone that has committed a genocide or gone on a killing spree. By sheer math, you can only kill them. So, Mr. Speaker, that's obviously a little bit better. But Brent already provided you, I think, what is a better response, actually, that we don't commit the crime back to you. Ryan says these people tormented their victims, therefore, even if this is cruel and unusual, we have a right to torment them. Mr. Speaker, that's not how the justice system ought to work, and I think there's a huge problem with that, insofar as if society is saying torturing someone or subjecting them to mental anguish, as Ryan says, is wrong, it seems entirely hypocritical for me to sit for them and say, well, the state should just do it back to them. If it's wrong in the first place and we're punishing them for doing it, I don't understand why they derive any justice from the state doing it back to them. Also, the last big thing that Wudi harps on a lot. In some crimes are so horrific that individuals forfeit their right to life. He repeated this a lot. But the depth of the analysis was literally, some crimes are so horrific that individuals forfeit their right to life. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to say genocide's a good thing. I'm not going to say mass killing is a good thing, obviously. But I think that if society wants to if we win the moral arguments around it, the state shouldn't kill people, then I don't think it really matters how vicious the crimes were. Part of the justice system is detaching the emotional revenge element and dealing with how to prevent that individual from committing crimes in the future. We achieve that on our side of the house. I think that's actually really, really important. So the last thing that I think is a big issue in this round, that both opposition speakers come up, is the rights of victims. Because Ryan really planted his flag, and Wudi a little bit as well, on victims having the right to have these people die. A few reasons, some of them silly, some of them a little bit better. So the really silly one. People see their tax money being used to feed and house these people. I mean, sure. But even accepting that that's true, weigh up the harms of my tax money is being used to fund someone's existence versus someone else's right not to die. Right? Like, I think if you weigh it up proportionally as they love, it just doesn't make much sense. But secondly, the other big plank they have under victims is restitution, restorative justice. They want victims to feel a sense of closure. But Mr. Speaker, the psychological anguish and torment and grieving of people who have lost loved ones doesn't end when you kill the person who did it, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, I think making the taking of another life their last legacy is hugely problematic and doesn't actually address any of the concerns. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, even if the victims really want the person to die, part of the justice system is to give the victims a say, but never to give them the only say, never to let the emotional attachment that someone very obviously has to the crime to cloud the judgment of the state. I think that's hugely problematic. So, Mr. Speaker, because I think we've demonstrated that the merely existing in society can't harm other people in and of itself, and that we should restrict rights where they harm others and the right to life can't be harmful, we are very proud.
Thank all the debaters for an excellent round. I invite them to cross the floor and shake hands.